Welcome to Drinking on the Edge. I'm David Fuhr, its host, co-producer. Here in the studio with me is my fellow co-producer, Matt Mercier. Joining us as our first-time co-host is my old friend and colleague from across the border in Ontario, Allison Slute. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Allison is the world reigning champion of Cabernet Franc.
Sure. Thank you.
And having her as co-hosting today, the first of a handful of episodes about this noble grape, we've chosen a theme that's halfway point between her and I, her in Ontario, me here in the Hudson Valley, and that is the Finger Lakes. The Finger Lakes is home to arguably the finest Rieslings made in the Americas, but we're here talking about a red wine, Cabernet Franc, and that opens up a lot of possibilities. More so as Allison and I are pleased to have as our guests no less than 5 of the Finger Lakes' finest vintners of all types. But before we launch into Cabernet, wide range of these lovely wines and samples that have been provided by these vintners, Allison, can you give a quick look into what is Cabernet Franc?
In my opinion, it's the world's greatest grape variety. But seriously, it's a very ancient grape variety. The ampelography data suggests that it's more than 2,000 years old. They're still trying to figure out all of its history, but it is probably one of the most important yet underrated grape varieties. It's planted everywhere thanks to Bordeaux's reputation. So everywhere we find Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, its 2 most important offspring, we find Cabernet Franc, but often in much smaller quantities. But there seems to be a really exciting movement happening of late. And New York is a perfect example of one of these places where Cabernet Franc is beginning to emerge as not a supporting character, but as the lead, which is very exciting.
Friend of the show and former guest, Dr. José Villamos, I recall reading in his writings and hearing from him as well, that there's some correlation between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc and part of its generic heritage?
They had an affair a long time ago. Cabernet Franc has had many affairs, to be very honest. It's also had an affair with Magdalene Noir de Charente, which is the other parent of Merlot. It's Cabernet Franc, being that it's been around for a very long time. It's had a number of mates, and it's had quite a lot of offspring, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot being the 2 most famous. It's also the parent of Carmenere. It's the parent of 2 Basque grape varieties as well, because they believe that Cabernet Franc originated from Basque country, the Spanish side of the border.
Let's not keep our guests waiting here. And Allison has been very stalwart in providing the basis of our agenda today. I'm going to pose the first question to our guests. Why Cabernet Franc for you?
I'm Nova Cadamatre with Trestle 31 here in the Finger Lakes. And for me, Cabernet Franc just offers the most quality potential of the red varieties we have at our disposal here in the Finger Lakes. It has a ton of complexity, can be made in a number of different styles and quality levels. And so it really is a variety, I think, that has a lot of runway for the area. So for me, it's a Bordeaux variety, and that's my wheelhouse. I love playing with Cabernet and Cabernet affiliates. That's my 2 cents.
Hi, this is Fred Merwarth from Hermann Wiemer Vineyard. And I would say we've looked at Cabernet Franc early on from a viticultural standpoint of what reds the Finger Lakes could consistently grow and what could consistently survive through the ups and downs of our winters and wildly different growing seasons from vintage to vintage. And Cabernet Franc was identified several decades ago as something that was quite durable both as cold tolerant, meaning that it can withstand minus 12 or minus 13 degrees and still have somewhat of a crop. That is very similar to Riesling, as we have experienced here in the Finger Lakes, Riesling being something that we are leaning in on and are getting recognition with. That was not by chance, that was by trial and error and realizing that Riesling had this hardiness. And then I think the region as a whole was looking for another variety on the red side to fill that position. And so Cabernet Franc has done that And it's also proving that on growing season side of being a fairly durable variety to withstand our humidity and kind of rain periods. So it works really well from that standpoint.
It's good to know.
And this is Kelby Russell, winemaker at Apollo's Praise, just down the road from Fred at Wiemer, as it were. And I would echo both of his and Nova's sentiments. I think it's also maybe the curse of being a Riesling winemaker that you love making different iterations of wines. We all have like the joke about German Rieslings and the different classifications and the styles. And I think for better or worse, Cabernet Franc lends itself to that mentality. You can make both stylistic differences and winemaking and what you're aiming for, right through rosé and many different reds. And it's also very terroir expressive. And I think that terroir sort of signature of the grape makes it fascinating, especially in the Finger Lakes when we have such a remarkably varied set of soils depending where you are.
I think that's all spot on. Pretty much you summed up some of the main reasons why I do the work that I do in terms of this variety is because of its versatility, which I find fascinating. And on the red side especially, there aren't as many varieties on the red side that are quite as versatile. And the site sensitiveness, I think, is a really interesting point. And the more I taste it, the more that character, I think, of the grape and character trait of the grape really comes through. We covered how Franc is well suited to the Finger Lakes. So how do your expressions compare to those fashioned in Cabernet Franc's native land of France, either Bordeaux or the Loire or somewhere else?
I guess it's the order of operations. So I make two styles of Cabernet Franc. So I make Cabernet Franc Rosé and red Cabernet Franc. I would say Bordeaux, it's hard to compare a varietal Cab Franc to Bordeaux because they tend to be blends in Bordeaux. I have not met a single variety Cabernet Franc from Bordeaux yet, although I'm sure there's probably some random person doing one. For me, it's given our cool climate and the analogous climate we have to the Loire, that's the natural progression of comparison. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I really love the wines of St. Nicholas de Bourgogne. I feel like they have lots of concentration to them. And so that's even above and beyond what you would typically see from Chinon, which tends to be a little bit lighter. Yeah, that's the way I tend to go with the reds. And then the rosé, actually, my biggest inspiration for rosé is Provence, but Provence with like brightness. Oh. And even though Provence has nothing to do with Cabernet Franc, I just think stylistically, it's a really fun style that I really enjoy drinking, but I've always wished it had a little more acid. And so that's what I make, is a Provence wine with freshness.
It's actually super interesting that you mentioned Saint Nicolas de Bourgogne, because the soils actually, while they are certainly different, in Saint Nicolas and in Bordeaux, they essentially have what are alluvial soils, which is essentially what is in the Finger Lakes, at least overlying the shale and the limestone, is sands and gravels and clays and things like that. And that is exactly what Cabernet Franc thrives on in the Loire. So I think the comparison is spot on.
I really enjoyed your rendition of your Cab Franc Rosé. I remember last year you gracing me with a bottle. It was quite delicious and fun and quite expressive of the grape. You couldn't mistake it for anything else.
Yeah, I think our style or our interpretation of it has meandered a little bit. And part of that, I think, is just the work that has to go into understanding how to work with the varietal and also how to work with it from the place that it's grown. Our styling very early on, I remember had a criticism of our early Cab Francs as being red wines made by a white winemaker. I took great offense to that. I think in 2008, maybe a little insecure after taking over from Hermann in 2007. And we really pushed some extraction and ripeness. And so the 10, 11, 12, 13, 15 are pretty, for I think what we have tasted and seen in the Finger Lakes, pretty powerful. But for me, when I look back at those wines, I'm not always impressed by them. I'm talking about our own wines here. And so part of that is pulling back on the extraction, maybe pulling back a little bit on the ripeness, and really trying to find that more delicate balance of fruit that is coming off of our blocks, and then also how does all the plant material work together. And so we do two styles of Cabernet Franc, one that's about 90% stainless steel, that is a little fresher, little brighter, and then a single vineyard that does live in 500 liter barrique and is a little bit more extracted. Again, I think we've thought and started to pull back a little bit and maybe lean where we were thinking Bordeaux 15 years ago, going back and really gravitating towards what is coming out of Loire and why do we like those wines.
I think too that's also a product of just the region also maturing. It's obviously your own personal experience, but I think the region as well. I can certainly speak for the Niagara Peninsula. Is that I've seen a shift in terms of the wines over the last 20 years, and it was very much. And I think that's actually a very common kind of. I've tasted a number of Cabernet Francs from Hungary, for example, and I think Hungary is going through the same phase at the moment where they're in this Bordeaux mindset that their Francs need to be these big, bombastic reds, and it's not necessarily. Maybe think about it in a little bit more of a different way. So that's very cool to hear your experience.
They might be stuck in the Parker era mentality.
Lord knows.
They are geographically more remote.
They are a touch.
I saw myself go through the same pattern that Fred did, and I think that the region did, where for a number of years it was about making more extracted, showing what you could do with the fruit, especially because when I was coming into the region, the number one criticism leveled at Cab Francs was that they were green. You would have people who didn't know anything about wine, but they would come in knowing that Cab Franc could taste like bell pepper, and they associated that with it being poor or bad, and no sort of understanding that maybe there are these herbaceous expressions that are what make the grape. So I think that learning curve has been fascinating. And for me, my favorite style that I make is actually the stainless steel style. I think freshness of it is what I find myself opening at home much more often than maybe as impressive as a more textured, extracted style might be. I think the charm of Cabernet Franc is something that's really distinct. And I think Finger Lakes Cab Franc does seem to have a particular character to it. And I don't want to put my stamp on what that is, but I'll say that I had a bottle that showed up in a blind tasting with a bunch of Japanese and French sommeliers when I was at Wine Paris, and they were absolutely bamboozled by it. They had no idea where to place it. And some people ended up in Beaujolais, and some people ended up in Northern Rhone. No one said Cab Franc, and they could piece it together after the fact. But I don't take that necessarily as an insult to the wine. The Finger Lakes, if you haven't tasted Finger Lakes Cab Franc, you don't quite know how to place it. And then once you've had a few, I think they're quite recognizable.
Kelby, your comments about the supposed greenness that Cabernet Franc possesses in its cooler growing areas, Finger Lakes being one of them. How is it that you and your colleagues there manage the pyrazines that can be so present in Cabernet Franc? How do you manage them in the vineyard and in the winery to fashion the kind of wine that you want, pyrazines or not?
I think it really, pyrazine-wise, it really comes down to vineyard management above and beyond all else. That's the number one thing, and it seems that the number one thing is actually sunlight exposure, even more so than maybe heat or growing degree days. And it's something that I think maybe the Finger Lakes is realizing is an ace up our sleeve. Our neighbors across the border as well have a similar setup where the grape hangs tough, and it hangs late into the season without losing its acidity. So we don't get pushed into picking the fruit earlier on in the growing season because sugar is too high or acid's dropping out. And it means that we can get really quite beautiful berry fruit ripeness with less pyrazine if you want to go that route. Or if you're working with a shaded vineyard, we have a site that we intentionally keep umbrella trained with the Cab Franc, and that results in much more of the pyrazine character, for better or worse.
Nova, Fred, do you have any comments in that regard?
There was probably around the same time, 2008, 2009, there was a big push from Cornell, coming from, I think, from the growers also, to really understand viticulturally how to ripen Cabernet Franc. I think and ripen it in a Bordeaux frame of reference. So a lot of viticultural work, certainly a lot of chemical work in terms of what's happening in the berries, what's happening in the clusters, what's happening in the canopy, was done to Kelby's point of whittling all that down to, say, sunlight. And so canopy management became this really hot topic of getting leaves out, full cluster exposure. The question was, how early do you do it? Do you do it at ration? Do you do it at right after fruit set? And the viticulture has moved really hard into that as a commonality now. And I think one thing that we're thinking about working on the viticulture side, is that too much? And is that relative to site or clonal selection? Is that full canopy leaf removal? Is that producing wines that are outside of maybe stylistically within the Finger Lakes or per winemaker? So I think I have a lot of questions about that, and we've been working on canopy management a lot to rein that in a little bit and maybe fine tune it regarding the clonal selection or the site, how much leaf removal you actually do. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's very much around vineyard management. And really, it does come down to a combination of leaf management, picking decisions, the heat that it's been exposed to, the sunlight it's been exposed to. Because even in Napa, I work bicoastally, and we still see pyrazine in Cabernet Franc if it hasn't had enough sun and the leafing hasn't been done. So it is this not necessarily a cool climate only issue, but definitely something that is very key to watch in the vineyard with Cabernet Franc.
It's a discussion you can't really get away from with the variety, because it is the one in the Bordeaux family that has the highest concentration of it. But to your point, Nova, actually in the Loire, green bell pepper is considered a fault. Like, it's just a generally accepted thing that if you get a Cab Franc from the Loire with an overt green pepper, somebody did something wrong and they consider it a fault. They really look at it in terms of this very broad spectrum of leafy, herbal, vegetal. They call them often noble vegetal notes that they think are admirable qualities, but they do consider green bell pepper to be a fault per se.
Joining Fred Merwarth from Hermann J. Wiemer Vineyards and Winery, and Kelby James Russell of Apollo's Praise and Nova Cadamatre of Trestle 31, we just got in Bruce Murray from Boundary Breaks. We're just going to the issue of how to contend with pyrazines in Cabernet Franc in the vineyard. But let's expand this out a little further and ask you to lead off by saying, what are some other unique challenges that Cabernet Franc faces in the vineyard, aside from the pyrazine issue? Is there anything there in particular that you watch out for in the vineyard?
So we think that the pyrazine issue is related to what we call canopy management, where we decide what kind of foliage to leave and what kind of foliage to take off. And that ties back to the type of trellising that you establish when you actually plant the vineyard. And we have followed, I think, advice that comes most directly through Cornell and the Cornell viticultural program. About 10 years ago, they invited the vineyard manager from Cheval Blanc in France to the Finger Lakes to speak specifically about Cabernet Franc. And he was really fairly open about how their vineyard practices with respect to canopy management are handled. And the advice, guidance, practice that they described was actually starting very early in the season when there are pea-sized berries on the clusters and removing leaves around those clusters at that time. It does a lot of things. It ultimately reduces the pyrazine concentrations, but it also exposes the fruit to more sunlight from the very beginning. And it also allows you to get better spray coverage, since we have seasons that are higher pressure mold and mildew seasons, and you want to have the plants as well protected as you can early on. And we've had experience where we've had very warm, dry springs. We've held off on spraying because we didn't feel the spray pressure or the mold pressure was that significant. And then as we got further and further into the season, it seemed harder and harder to catch up. So our view is to be pretty vigilant early on and make sure you can see the berries on every cluster as you walk down the row.
You did mention and that was certainly one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, obviously, vintage variation is a thing in the Finger Lakes. And I'm very curious as to, you mentioned some recent vintages that had a bit more mildew pressure than others.
Just looking at the last 4 vintages, pretty wide swings. I think that's pretty typical for us. And our approach to them hasn't changed very much in the last, and I've gravitated towards that of not changing too much, even regarding vintage. I really do think that is one of our superpowers here, is that we do have vintage variation, and certainly your harvesting decisions are going to vary tremendously. But viticulturally, we're trying to stay on a pretty straight path of, as we were talking canopy management, we do only leaf pull on one side, keeping the morning sun, getting a lot of sun in on the morning, get fruit dried out, and not leaf pulling on the west facing side. Keep the canopy, keep the clusters cool, keep the plants a little cooler. And then just playing by ear as the harvest goes. I do enjoy not having to rush Cabernet Franc in, like 21, 19, 24. We definitely felt stressed to get Cabernet Franc in a manner that, as we were talking before, of maintaining acidity and a vibrancy to it that I've now come to expect. For I think, along with Bruce, those kind of cooler vintages, I think we make absolutely beautiful wines in them. But as we all know, I think we're going to have to learn how to deal with the 24s and the 22s and the 16s and still make beautiful wines in those vintages. I have a little bit more to say about that, but I'll hold that.
I think one thing we haven't, going back to your question, David, about what else about Cabernet Franc should we really be talking about? So I'm going to throw a little bit of a grenade in here and say that Cabernet Franc loves to make fruit. It is super high yielding, and if you leave it alone, it will make a very high crop that you then have to come back and really adjust pretty heavily to get into a realm where, for quality winemaking, you're getting to a point that it's nice and balanced for not only for the vine itself, but also for what you want to do with the vine. So I'll throw that out there, but I'm sure Fred and Kelby, who are both heavily involved in vineyards, would have more to add to.
That could be a characteristic coming from its Sauvignon Blanc lineage, perhaps. It's fecundity.
Cabernet Franc loves to produce fruit. And I think the key word is balance. It's not the idea that you can drop all the fruit and go down to 1 ton an acre and get the best wine out of it. It's allowing the vine to carry enough fruit to ripen everything correctly, but not to go crazy. I'd say vintage-wise, we've had quite a bit of variation. I think for people who are out in the market, you're probably seeing a lot of 22s and 23s. Both of those were really nice vintages for different reasons, but 2 nice vintages in a row. 24, when you start seeing those, we haven't talked a lot as colleagues yet since harvest, but I think the feeling on 24 is that it was a pretty strong vintage in the Finger Lakes. Now really nice, especially in autumn, warm, dry, sunny. But I'd say Cabernet Franc really shines in the vintage that we haven't talked about, which is the black sheep of 2021, when it just never stopped raining all summer long, all fall long. And I think it's a feather in the cap of Cab Franc that it actually still performed really well. I'm not going to say those wines are as profound as other vintages of Cabernet Franc, but the fact that you could still make rosé and red wine from Cab Franc in a pretty terrible vintage that was really nice and maybe a little bit more on the fresh fruit side and a little softer, but certainly it paid for itself in the vineyard that year when other grapes were much more troubled.
That said, all of you sidestepped showing us your 2021, so no 2021s were forthcoming in Allison's and mine shipments of your wines that we will be tasting here shortly.
But on the topic of vintage variation, how do we have these conversations then with the consumer? And that's what I think is just as important. Internally, it's one thing to observe these vintages, but in a region where there is vintage variation, particularly with reds, how are you shaping that dialogue with consumers at the cellar door or with your restaurant customers or retail customers about the differences that you see in Cab Franc from vintage to vintage?
21, which we've talked about, wasn't what seemed like to be our favorite year in terms of the way the weather treated us. It was also a very huge year. We had lots and lots of fruit, which meant that our practice tends to be to release a wine and then keep pouring it until it's gone. And in 21, that meant we had a lot of Cab Franc, and it took a long time to work through it all to the end. And by the time we were toward the latter part of pouring that vintage to our consumers, it had been in the bottle for 2.5, sometimes almost 3 years. And it was really a beautiful wine. after that much time in the bottle. And I think one of the things that we, being small producers and not having the luxury of holding wines back for a long time, we probably are giving our consumers these wines a little bit early in their lives. And that's just the nature of our business. But if we could hold them back or else have them understand that younger wines are what they are, and they can tell you a lot about what they'll be, but they're not ready often when we release them.
Josh Wigg from Lamoureaux Landing, what you have to say?
We're currently pouring our 21 vintage at the cellar door. What we do to educate our consumers and our club members, anyone that'll listen about Cab Franc, is that it does shine, but for different reasons in every vintage. And the 21 was no exception. Those hot and dry years, those are great. But generally, we're harvesting a few weeks earlier to get the acidity that we would naturally get anyways in a cooler vintage with full hang time. With all that being said, I definitely find, and we actually hold commercial quantities of selected vintages back for sale in the tasting room to pour side by side, and consistently vintages like 2018, 2021, where we have that vibrant acidity, and if we capture it, that is a backbone for aging these wines for many years, if not decades. I think that's an unexplored dimension and another factor that just makes Cabernet Franc great, especially in our cool climate.
So true.
Yeah, I would tend to echo what Josh and Bruce said. We tend to, all of my reds stay in barrel for 18 months, and then we keep it in bottle for a year after that. And so our release cycle is naturally a little delayed from what most folks are doing around the area. And what I typically see is that around the time we get ready to release the next vintage, the prior vintage is just really singing. And so we had a very brief overlap with our 21 and our 22 in the tasting lounge. And the 21 was just so elegant. And so I just described it from a stylistic perspective as this is more of, if you love Pinot Noir or you love really lighter, elegant styles, this is going to be the wine you're going to like. And if you like really big, bold wines, like more of a Napa style, you're going to love the 22. And it was very interesting to see who gravitated towards which style. And it was very enjoyable, actually, to have both of them in the tasting lounge, being able to pour both of them side by side for a brief period of time.
Yeah, I think agreeing with everybody. The ability to pour vintages side by side really does help every customer just see the qualities that each wine has, and not to I think we're getting much better as a region of talking about the vintages as they are and the qualities that we're able to pull out in those vintages. And as you compare them wine to wine, then the customer will gravitate towards whatever they like about that wine, not because it's a cool vintage or a warm vintage, but because what they like about that. And I think that is as a region, us maturing a little bit, having some library wines, having some inventory to work with to be able to present that. And we probably all have experienced this, where you have customers that gravitate towards your 21 over your 22, or your 21 over your 20. And when we all know what went into a vintage, good and tough, challenging, it does warm your heart a little bit when someone gravitates to that 21 and you're like, man, yeah, we worked really hard to pull this together. And I think, again, that's one of the powers of Cabernet Franc, that it will show itself in and give us tools even in those really tough vintages.
Totally. Speaking of trying two vintages side by side, now that Josh is on the call, we have two vintages of Josh's T23 Cabernet Franc, a 2022 and a 2020. Josh, can you speak a little bit about this wine? I know it's one that Lamoureaux is quite famous for.
I don't know about famous, but I certainly appreciate the sentiment. It is one that we're very proud of and that we've been doing for a long time. So 2002 was the first vintage that we put Cab Franc out there in its purest form. And we've done one every year since. We learn a little bit every year, mostly about how much we don't know about the grape. And it's really a fascinating style. It's evolved a little bit, but largely it is very fruit focused. Starts its life on the skins, half to 2/3 sugar depletion. It's going to get pressed off. Originally, it went to tank 23, so that was the T23 designation. It's outgrown that vessel now, so it's living in 3 different tanks now, so it is grown in popularity and distribution, which is a good thing, but it finishes primary and goes completely through ML and tank. Very reductive. That's how we like to keep it. It usually flirts with some reductive notes early, but after 6 months in the bottle or so, it becomes pretty measured in that respect. But it's just a style that, without those oak tannins, it really shines with just about any type of cuisine and really showcases what our vineyards and the grape has to offer. It plays on the acidity, it plays on the herbal notes. Warmer vintages really get in and explore the kind of darker fruit profile. So it's a lot of fun to make, and certainly I think it's a good foot forward for us at Lamoureaux.
Having your 20 and 22 side by side to taste, would you characterize your 2020 vintage as a warmer vintage than 2022? To my palate, it seems that way.
Yes, very much. We were over 3,000 growing degree days in 2020. And certainly it was much drier in our vineyards. I know there's a lot of variability and precipitation all over the world, but especially in the Finger Lakes over the last 5 to 7 vintages. The volatility of weather and precipitation has to come into play here. Even Cab Franc is not immune to that variation, but 2020 was our hottest, driest year in the last 50 years. 22 had heat, but more precipitation, and I think more when we needed it. So I don't think we had as much kind of drought stress and maybe not as much concentration of those like darker fruit character, but pound for pound, pH, acidity, in terms of the other characteristics of the wine, I think they're very similar, but I agree with you. Definitely a little shift in the profile.
Yeah. Actually, as a matter of fact, I can speak to Niagara Peninsula, which has very similar vintages as the Finger Lakes. I find the 22s to be a lot fresher than the 20s. The 20s that I've had from the Niagara Peninsula are just ginormous. Like, there is a distinctive ripeness to them. You remarked that your T23 isn't necessarily famous, but I will say the very first time I came to the Finger Lakes in 2021, I asked every single person what Cabernet Franc I needed to try. No one I asked did not mention the T23. It was really quite funny because it was like literally every single person, you got to try the Lamoureaux T23. It's unoaked. And everybody was so excited by it. And quite frankly, I love unoaked styles of Cabernet Franc. I think it gets me very excited when I see people that are willing to undress the grape, so to speak, and put it out there in its most naked form. And so it takes a lot of confidence to do that as well. And it's, like you said, it's not easy. And there's certainly challenges that come with that reduction. There's all kinds of issues. But when it's done well, I think the wines can be so pleasurable. Kudos to you I think perhaps you were one of the first to embrace the whole unoaked Cabernet Franc thing. And I'm sure it's probably set a different chapter forward for the Finger Lakes in terms of thinking about Cab Franc in that way. Awesome.
I don't know if it bolsters our confidence anymore or just confirms our craziness, our insanity. But thank you anyways.
That's terrific. Why don't we talk about Kelby's two new, the Apollo's Praise, my first time tasting the Apollo's Praise Cabernet Franc. I was a fan of your work at Red Newt when you were there. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Nut Road and then the La Homa Vineyard Cabernet Franc?
Yes, 2 styles of Cab Franc. I think a similar split that a lot of us are seeing in our portfolios, where it's great to have more stainless steel or less oak-driven style, maybe more sort of crunchy fruit, crunchy tannin, which is the Nut Road in our instance, which is a vineyard site that I worked with for a long time under my own label and wanted to continue working with in launching Apollo's Praise. So it's one of the Anthony Road vineyard sites on northwest Seneca Lake. Beautiful fruit. This is, I would say, a learning curve wine for me over the years. I've been making this style since 2014 and realized that the trick with stainless steel, at least for my palate, is that I really want to over extract during fermentation and just immediately post fermentation, because so much of the tannin falls away in the stainless steel aging process afterwards. So the first few vintages I made of it would be beautiful coming off the press, would go into tank. And then by the time they got to bottle a few months later, were still really nice wines, but structure-wise were more like a really heavy rosé than they were a red wine, even though the color might suggest otherwise. And so for that style, for me, I've settled into a pretty heavy punch-down rotation for it, and then in particular about a month and a half on the skins and stems after fermentation wraps up before pressing it off, which always results in the fun of pressing off in the snow in December, which is a great party trick. But the result is that the wine is pretty tannic at that point, I'd have to say. It's not, you have to overshoot so that you can finish at a good balance point. And so that's the sort of like nitty gritty of that wine. The 24 iteration is changing names from Nut Road Vineyard to Picardie, which is partially because we're working with some of our own fruit in it, and partially because that's the name of the glass tumblers you get in a French bistro. And that was very much the inspiration for this style, is this sort of everyday, very much food directed expression of Cab Franc. And
I think those that work a lot with Cabernet Franc, and this goes the world over, like those that spend a lot of time with the variety in the vineyard and in the cellar, most remark that it is not the easiest grape to work with in either the vineyard or the cellar. And it has a whole host. You really have to, you can't just half-ass it, pardon the expression, but you can't really, with Cabernet Franc, you have to really babysit it and pay attention to it. And actually, as a matter of fact, we were speaking about Cheval Blanc earlier. 2 years ago, I was in Bordeaux for the very first Cabernet Franc symposium that brought together Bordeaux and Loire producers. And the managing director of Cheval Blanc, Pierre-Olivier Clouet, he actually remarked, he called Cabernet Franc a diva of a variety. And I was kind of like, wow, really? But he was adamant. He's like, no, it's a diva. It's like, you rub it the wrong way and it will get, it'll get in your face. And you gotta prim it proper. It's a bit of a prima donna, but I like the Nut Road a lot. I was familiar with your work with this wine when you were working with Red Newt, and I think you captured some really lovely purpley notes in this wine that I really love, like violets and kind of blueberries and that kind of thing that I think is really pretty. And you don't often see the blue fruited side of Cabernet Franc come through, and when it does, it's a particular side that I really love.
Thank you. Yeah. And then the La Homa bottling is radically different. So that is our estate site on sandstone. This is intentionally the more savory, herbaceous style, and actually in comparison to the Nut Road, a lighter style. But rather than being stainless steel, well, the fermentation handling is similar. This is fermented in a 1,500 liter oak vat, and then after pressing off, ages back in that same vat until the following vintage, basically. Try to empty it out at the same time that the next wine, or the fruit for the next vintage wants to go in, to minimize empty time of oak vessels. But it's a much more elegant expression, I suppose, might be the way to put it. I find that people's reactions to the two are quite varied between which one they like better. It responds to how people respond to it, I think, reflects how diverse Cab Franc can be and how diverse Cab Franc drinkers can be.
I think it's actually really opening up. I opened everything last night. And I think last night, the La Homa was a little tight. It was a little bit, I'm not sure if it was ready to be opened yet. But now it's starting to show that much more herbal, floral side of things, which I think is really quite pretty. In terms of the consumer awareness in general, I have a little pause on this point, and we're talking about consumers reacting to different vintages, et cetera. Do the consumers understand what Cabernet Franc is? Like, is there awareness around this variety like there is with, perhaps not there is with Riesling, but what are the impressions from consumers about the Finger Lakes Cab Francs?
Certainly, I'll start. Certainly it's increasing. And I think East Coast U.S. cities in particular, because there's so much Cab Franc being produced locally from Virginia on up, consumers on the East Coast actually do seem to have some understanding, or that understanding is starting to come around. I think 15 years ago, you would almost feel like you had to apologize for pouring a Cabernet Franc at a tasting. And now, more often than not, especially, yeah, we'll just say Finger Lakes Red in general is instead. And now I can't count the number of times just in the last year when I'm doing market work or showing wines, and in particular for us distribution-wise in New York City, that people say, "Oh, I love Finger Lakes Cab Franc," or "Oh, great, I was hoping you'd have a Cab Franc," which it feels like you hit your head and are having delusions compared to what it used to be like.
Well, that's
people
good to
be excited about it.
That's great to know, because that segues nicely into the fact that on the 5th of last month, you had the first ever Cabernet Franc Forward event, and it wasn't relegated to the Finger Lakes alone. It was a New York State project. So there, of course, were credible ones coming from Long Island and what's here in my backyard in the Hudson Valley. That's good on that. But it also draws my attention to the fact that y'all doing some really good other red reds there too. Blaufränkisch Lemberger, Pinot Noir, but you decided to stick your neck out red-wise with Cabernet Franc. Nova, because I know you got to bust out of here shortly. Can you speak to my comment and then go into talking about your version of Trestle 31?
Sure. I was not one of the original organizers of the Cab Franc Forward. I have been beating the drum for years that we, as an area, needed to get off of the Riesling is our grape. Even though I love Riesling, nothing wrong with the Riesling.
You make some good ones.
With the fact that we're making great Riesling, but I think we needed something that was a little more easy to sell in the marketplace. And I think coming out as a New York State saying that Cabernet Franc is our variety because it can be grown in so many different areas of the state. And I think it's a really great idea to not only come together as a state and promote a variety that grows really well here, but also show the diversity of styles that are available in different growing regions, like the maritime climate down on Long Island, all the way up through Hudson and here the Finger Lakes, and also out by the Erie Belt. So I think it's a great opportunity for that. Yes, my apologies. I do have to go pick up my son this afternoon from school. Talking about the 22 Trestle 31 Cabernet Franc. 21 was our first vintage of Cabernet Franc for Trestle. And while I am very happy with what we were able to produce that year, and it's a gorgeous wine, I just felt that there was so much more that was available that wasn't available that particular vintage, going back to the vintage variation discussion. And in 22, it was one of those vintages that life hands you that's just here, go forth and make great wine. And so that made it very easy. The real key defining feature that was different from a lot of vintages here in the Finger Lakes was the berry size. The berry weight was actually pretty close to, a little bit above, but pretty close to what I see in Napa for berry weight size. So average berry weight was like right around 1.2 grams per berry in 2022, where typically I'm seeing over 2 grams per berry here. So the concentration level, the skin to juice ratio, was insane out here. And so that was really exciting to see. Ergo, there was a lot of stuffing to work with, and being able to really put all my winemaking in Napa to practice here was a lot of fun. It is 40% new French oak. It was 5 barrels total. It's a brand new Taranceau medium toast barrel and medium toast d'Argos-Jaglais barrel. So I think those 2 barrels work really well on Cabernet Franc. D'Argos-Jaglais brings a little elegance to the wine, and then Taranceau for me is just my go-to Bordeaux barrel, and it brings like a really nice respect for the fruit while adding a really gorgeous structure to it. And then the balance was all neutral French, and I really believe in tailoring the amount of new oak to the vintage. The 2021 was only 20% new because it just didn't have the same level of stuffing, whereas the 22 was just begging for some additional. And I realized there was a lot of comments up here made about the oak versus the stainless steel styles, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with the stainless steel styles, but I am going to die on the hill of French oak. And I love what it brings to the wine. And for me, and this is me personally as a winemaker, I've always just felt like it's just not complete without a little spice. But having the right spice is really important. And I really pick my coopers very intentionally for the styles of wine I'm making, and I know what styles work with what varieties, and so that's what I really focus on. So again, this was ML in barrel and 18 months aging in barrel, and then a year in bottle post that. So we just released this 22 last month.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I love, Nova, that you said that Cabernet Franc is easier to sell than Riesling.
It is easier to sell than Riesling. Riesling is so difficult.
It just makes me laugh because the amount of people that I have, professionals that have asked me, is like, is Cabernet Franc ever going to get easier to sell? Because it's hard. And I'm like, I don't know. So it just made me chuckle when you said that it's easier to sell.
Well, you look at it, selling wine in general is hard. It is the hardest part of this industry is selling it. We can make it all day, we can grow it all day, but getting out in the market and getting somebody to go, yeah, I want to buy that is the hardest thing. But then you're like, you add on to the layer of it's hard to sell New York wine in addition to hard to sell wine. And then it's hard to sell a really hard to sell variety from a region that most consumers aren't really aware of in a difficult market to sell wine. It's just like, how many things do we want to pile on of challenges for us?
We'll get on to challenges forthwith, but Allison, let's move on to the next wine if we could.
Fred has center stage. So tell us about we've got your 22, I guess the classic Cab Franc. We also have the 23 Magdalena Vineyard.
We were doing very traditional, straightforward fermentation for a long time. 1-ton bins with punch downs, pressed at dryness. And again, part of that shift was for me trying to get away from just a lot of red fruit and try to figure out what other characters the variety had to give, especially from our Magdalena site. The other part of that was these were mostly all young vineyards. So they are going to just give you a lot of red fruit in those primary years, those first 10 vintages. But we started to move towards about 30% whole cluster on all of our Cabernet Francs. Actually, all of our red wines are all 30% or more whole cluster. And a lot of times I will even sneak more stems in at stemming. The 22 Cabernet Franc was all open top ferment with pump over to begin and then punch down to finish, about 35 days of fermentation. And we press at dryness right into stainless steel ML in tank. And about 90% of that is all stainless steel with just a little bit in barrel. Magdalena is a wine that we've been making since 2005. Most of the fruit comes from the Magdalena area. It's 10 miles north of the winery on the west side of Seneca Lake, so about 10 minutes south of Geneva. It's a pretty warm spot. Soil pHs are really high, pushing almost 8 soil pH. Pretty weathered soils. It's a fast ripening site, so we have thought in terms of trying to slow things down. I've torn out most of the Pinot Noir from there because it just ripens too quickly. And this block of Cabernet Franc we planted in 2004. I started making wine in 2005, which sounds ridiculous, but it showed a very different cluster formation than any other Cabernet Franc that we've seen. And part of it's a fairly densely planted vineyard. We changed the row orientation to east-west versus our traditional north-south. We tightened up the spacing between vines to 2.5 feet. So that makes it around 2,200 vines per acre versus all of our other plantings, which are around 1,600 vines per acre. And all of a sudden we see these really loose, long clusters, really tiny berries. And we noticed that in 2005, and Herman and I were like, we have to make a single barrel from that and just see where that goes. And we've made this block on its own ever since. And it continues to show just this really long, loose cluster. And that is the basis of our single vineyard Magdalena Cabernet Franc. One thing that we've noticed in this really tight spacing is that they do ripen. The yields are pretty low, around 2.5 tons per acre. Something that Nova mentioned, Kelby mentioned, Cabernet Franc does want to produce. In these really dense plantings, we've noticed that we don't get this really intense foliage and also intense cropping. That, I think, also contributes to this Magdalena Cabernet Franc with its kind of density and structure. One thing we have incorporated into the regular Cabernet Franc, the 22, is picking in stages, a lot like we do with Riesling. So we're picking almost 3 weeks earlier to get some acidity, capture that freshness, and then pick over those next 3 weeks. So it is a little bit of change. It's funny because with a variety that has this notorious green streak and being cautious about that, thinking about putting green stems into that is counterintuitive. As long as those stems aren't chopped up and chewed up, it doesn't impart any green. It's tannins. I think it helps in the fermentation with aeration. And yes, it's a question we ask ourselves,
that's a great answer.
Yeah.
I'll take it.
All right.
We'll move on to the last wine and then we'll wrap it up. So Bruce, you're on deck with your 2023 Cabernet Franc.
Okay. So we started 17 years ago only planting Riesling because we thought we could sell Riesling. It didn't seem like it would be a problem. And we just couldn't quite sell enough of it. So we said, okay, let's try to branch out. And we planted the Bordeaux varieties in 13. That is Cab Franc, Merlot, and a little Cabernet Sauvignon. And our first Cab Franc vintage was in 17. So we've really only been making it really not for very long. Like Kelby said, 7, 8, 10 years ago, people would come in who had a background in wine, who had tasted a lot of wine. They would come to the Finger Lakes expecting to taste Riesling but not expecting much in the red category. So our initial perception was we needed to bring a red to the table that was not necessarily an extremist kind of Cabernet Franc. And so we got out of the box blending in a little Merlot, because we think Merlot brings a quality to the Cab Franc that at the time consumers were looking for, a little roundness, a little less edge, a little less sort of rusticity in the wine. And over time, we have experimented with proportions, and that can vary from vintage to vintage. We've taken that too far in some cases where you really lose the varietal character of the Cab Franc, and I think we've learned that along the way. But the 23 you have in front of you is a good example of what we've just finished our 22 vintage. This 23, it's 87% Cab Franc. It's our estate Cab Franc, and about 13% Merlot. And again, we think it's a really nice wine. It's from a long vintage, but again, I would say it shows what a really great future is going to have. If you open it and leave it open, I think you'll find it's really drinkable. I spend a lot of time with customers tasting, and so I'm obviously looking to get a sense before we even pour the first glasses. What brought them here? What kind of background in wine do they have? What are they looking for? What have they had? And then we try to consolidate all that information about people coming to the Finger Lakes. What are they expecting? And I would echo what Kelby said, that right now we're seeing a lot of people say, Riesling's my favorite white wine. They're now also saying, Cabernet Franc is my favorite red grape. It's food friendly. And so we're probably now moving a little bit toward a more classic Cab Franc and backing off on some of the blending. And you'll find that in that 23, I think.
Can you teach the Ontario consumers a little bit of that? Because I could say that the folks in Ontario aren't quite as...
They're not ready. Kudos to everyone who's been doing this with 100% Cab Franc from the very beginning.
That speaks to what Allison had indicated here as a final question. So I'll just take the bounce off that. Say, what should be done to continue this success that you've mentioned, Bruce? What can be done to further the success that you and your colleagues have achieved so far with Finger Lakes Cab Franc?
I think you mentioned the Cab Franc Forward event. We were involved in that, and I think the response was pretty stunning, actually. And it's just a matter of getting out and pouring it for people, because the wines are very good. Not just to Cab Franc lovers, they're very good for any wine lover. And I think the tendency toward lower alcohol reds is taken hold pretty significantly. So I think it's classic out there, getting out there and getting it in people's glasses. And when we do, very few people, it opens their eyes and they don't forget it, there's just a lot of people out there whose eyes we need to open.
How we can further the growth of Cabernet Franc from the Finger Lakes.
I agree with Bruce. It's all about education. Our only barrier is getting it across people's palates. And to echo what Allison's story earlier about a diva, it really is a show-stopping grape when you really stop and think about it and think about the multi-dimensional aspects of the grape and the number of wines and the number of foods and everything that it opens up in terms of the wine. We're all in, and we're going to keep beating the streets and talking and pouring for anyone that will listen and taste.
Is there yet a regionally defined style of Finger Lakes Cabernet Franc, or is it still too soon to tell?
I don't think so yet. That's not my feeling. Nova is very wedded to New Oak. Fred's got stems in there. Josh likes stainless steel. We're not there yet, but I don't think we should be.
But I think the versatility of Cabernet Franc as a grape variety is going to be one of the keys to success for the Finger Lakes, is the fact that you can make rosé from it. I understand there are even some producers that have played with a Blanc de Noir, still wine style. I think the more consumers see Cabernet Franc on a label, the more it's going to stick in their head that, no, that's not Cabernet Sauvignon. It's its own grape variety. And then they'll start to just by nature call it by name. Like they'll just know to ask for Cabernet Franc. So I think the more they see it in, whether it's in a rosé style or whether it's a sparkling or pet nat or who knows what, I think the more visibility that the words Cabernet Franc have on a label, that's going to only help with just awareness of the grape going forward. And ultimately, the more people ask for it, the more people will focus on it. And the more people focus on it, there's more collaboration and conversation. And it's a rising tide that will lift all ships, in my opinion.
Thank you all. Please join in.
One thing that I think the overall wine market has moved to a place where these styles of wines are going to drive the wine market. And I think that's a good place to be in, where the lower alcohol, lighter wines, or wines of whether it's vintage variation, I think we're in a really good place to let Cabernet Franc sing.
Thanks for that, Fred. And thank you all. Fred Merwarth of Hermann J. Wiemer Vineyards, Bruce Murray of Boundary Breaks, Kelby James Russell of Apollo's Praise, and Josh Wigg of Lamoureaux Landing, and in her absence, Nova Cadamatre of Trestle 31. Thank you for joining as guests to this episode of Drinking on the Edge, co-hosted for the first by Allison Slute of the Cabernet Franc Chronicles. Drinking on the Edge is located as part of Radio Free Rhinecliff in the Epicurean. And thank you all once again for Drinking on the Edge.
Thank you, David.